I remember the small sound my phone made, like it was a punch in the chest, one soft ping, and the familiar world I had been living in changed. I was making tea, the kettle whistling, the morning light thin across our kitchen table. He was across the hall getting dressed for work. We had been together for 8 years. We had a life that looked ordinary on the outside: coffee cups in the sink, shoes by the door, the same 2 names on our holiday cards. I trusted him the way you trust the ground beneath your feet. That ping was a message. From a number I didn't recognize. From a name I did, his ex. I don't want to dramatize that moment, but when I read the first line, the room tilted. It wasn't rude or violent. It was casual, almost friendly. "Hey, I'll be in town tomorrow." Beneath those words, 1,000 small things I hadn't seen before began to make sense. The odd text late at night I brushed off. The unexplained stops on his way home. The quiet over-explanation of where he'd been. I thought I had been imagining things. I thought maybe I was being insecure. I walked into the bedroom like someone moving underwater. He greeted me with that sleepy half-smile that had always made me melt. He kissed my forehead, and I let him. I wanted to ask. I wanted to tear the whole day open and spill everything out, but the way he kissed me made me freeze. I put the phone in my pocket and told myself to breathe. He left for work with a hug that felt like the last warm thing of the morning. I sat at the kitchen table and I replayed the message in my head. "I'll be in town tomorrow." That line became a drum. I kept telling myself to wait for evidence, wait for truth. That night I lay awake, the message a quiet hum. If I had known then what I know now, I would have stormed into his office, made him show me his phone, and demanded answers until my voice was raw. But that's not the kind of person I was, not yet. Instead, I started watching. I became quiet, sharp. Little things started to matter. A new scent on his clothes. A loyalty he suddenly felt the need to explain. I began to collect moments the way a juror collects testimony. That was the beginning of everything. We told ourselves a story. Over coffee and long grocery runs, we repeated the same truths. We loved each other. We were building a life. We were honest. Outside, friends nodded. Inside, there were the usual small disappointments. He forgot to take the trash out. I left dishes. We forgave, and life kept moving. People who don't look too closely would call our marriage normal. People who do look closely know how small silences can be the loudest things. He was a good man in many ways. Calm, patient, the kind who remembered birthdays and always fixed the sink. He made a good living. He had the kind of job that required dinners and occasional travel. I saw him at his best and believed that was who he always was. When you love a person, you tend to give them the benefit of every doubt. You make excuses for them because love is expensive and you don't want to waste it on suspicion. But over time, small things that once seemed minor became puzzle pieces. He started leaving his laptop face down more often. He muttered names into the phone when he thought I wasn't listening. He would say, "It's nothing," and I would believe him because believing is easier than living the alternative. The day before the message, we had laughed in the kitchen about something silly, one of those domestic jokes that lives between 2 people. He reached for my hand, and I felt warm. I thought the message was a fluke, a ghost of a life that had come before, nothing more than an old friend checking in. This is what betrayal disguises itself as: normal things, repeated until you can't tell the real from the rehearsed. I want you to understand that I didn't walk into this with hatred. I walked into it with trust, and that's what made the fall so violent. The next day, he left early for a meeting. He texted once at noon, running behind. That night he came home smelling faintly of a perfume I'd never smelled before. It was subtle, not the sharp, cheap spray you buy by the register, but something soft and old-fashioned, like someone who wears their memories. At first, I was calm. I told myself grown women don't jump to conclusions. I rehearsed sentences I would never say aloud. But each small proof I collected began to cluster into a pattern. He started working late more often. He took phone calls in the bathroom, then emerged laughing like a man who had just learned a private joke. He started being protective of his phone. "It's just work," he said, but the denial hung in the air differently than before, thinner, like a fabric stretched too far. I tried to catch him in a lie, not because I enjoyed the hunt, but because truth felt like a rescue. So I watched. I learned how he moved his hands when he lied. I learned his just work voice when he spoke into the other room. I followed the small trails people leave behind, an Uber ride on a Sunday at noon, a cafe check-in 2 towns away that he claimed was a client meeting. Walking the line between reasonable and obsessive is dangerous. I try to stay in the middle. I told myself I was being prudent, not paranoid. I made lists. Not everything I found was damning. Some of it could be explained. But then the messages started to sound less like friendly notes and more like threads being rewoven. I'll be in town tomorrow. It's been years. I miss the old days. When he came home one evening smelling of that same perfume, I asked him about it. He said nothing, then muttered, "Maybe it's the detergent." The way he mouthed the word detergent made me feel ridiculous for asking and small for believing. That's how betrayal works. It makes you question your instincts until you start doubting your own eyesight. I didn't find everything at once. Nothing dramatic like a hidden letter that explains a whole life. Betrayal is often a slow erosion. It's the camera that catches the blink and the small movements we didn't notice were rehearsed. It was a Sunday. He'd gone to run errands alone. I stayed home, pretending to read. At around 3, his laptop lit up on the kitchen counter. The screen glowed with recent tabs, and one of them was a flight search, 2 tickets, cheap dates, same name as his ex. I stood very still. I touched the keys with my fingertips and they were warm. That afternoon I opened his email when he wasn't looking because the truth had become an ache. I know that sounds extreme. It felt like survival. And there it was, not everything, but enough. Messages that began with pleasantries and turned into plans. Photos of 2 drinks at a bar. Texts that were thin on context, but heavy on tone. "I'm so glad we did that. When can we meet again?" The way they were written, they suggested something more than a friendly catch-up. When he came home, I pretended I hadn't seen anything. I could feel my hands trembling, my breath moving like someone running. I didn't confront him in the moment because shock made me careful. I wanted to build a case, not destroy whatever shred of us remained in a moment of fury. So I took screenshots. I made copies. I saved every message like a tiny witness. I watched him that night, noticing how he recited the story of his day. He was careful, logical, almost rehearsed, and I could see the way his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. 100 little things proved a pattern. His ex wasn't just in town. She'd been trying to reconnect. She'd been polite in public, but the messages had a softness that belonged in private. I tucked the proof into a folder on my laptop and closed it. I didn't know what to do next. Part of me wanted to scream. Part of me wanted to pack and never come back. Part of me wanted to remind him, in the plainest words, that we were not disposable. Opportunities come in small packages. The next week, he told me he had to go to a conference out of town. A conference that conveniently matched the dates in the flight search I'd found. Everything in me wanted to stay home and watch him leave, but instead I played calm like it came naturally. When he left, I followed him at a distance, not because I wanted a scene, but because I needed to know the scale of what I was dealing with. I saw him in the hotel lobby. He wasn't alone. His ex was there, smiling like someone who had never had to explain herself. He hugged her casually, the kind of hug people give to old friends. She laughed at something he said, and the sound landed in my chest like a stone. I could have walked up then. I could have grabbed him by the collar and ripped the fabric of their evening into frayed pieces. But I didn't. I sat in a cafe across the street and watched them for a long time. Their body language told a story the messages couldn't quite claim. She touched his arm. He turned toward her with a softness that made my hands go cold. Back home, I began to plan not how to hurt him, I didn't want him hurt, but how to make him see. People rarely wake up in the middle of their own stories and realize they have been living a lie. They need mirrors held up, polished and bright. They need the collective attention of truth. So I made a plan. Not a cruel one, but a clever, unavoidable one. I would gather evidence. I would let him choose the moment to be honest. If he chose concealment, I would expose him on terms that let the world see both the man he claimed to be and the choices he had made. Planning revenge, and I use that word carefully. I prefer reclaiming my truth is not about fireworks and melodrama. It's about strategy and timing and knowing the weakest point in a thread of lies. I started where I always do when I need evidence. I collected voices. First, I saved everything. Every message, every photo, every transaction. I printed them. I converted them into neat, physical pages that felt indisputable. Digital things can be dismissed with a click, but paper can be held up in a room and cannot be denied without explanation. Second, I began to speak to the people who mattered. Not to create drama, but to build a witness network. I contacted a friend of his from work who had once made a joke about old flames. She was careful at first, but as I explained my concerns, she remembered times he'd lied about overtime and dinners. She shared stories that matched the pattern I was building. Third, I traced the meetings. I looked at receipts, at social posts, at places that kept records. I found photos where their faces overlapped at events and where he had left out details in his retellings. I used his public presence as corroboration of the private life I had already seen on a screen. I did this not out of malice, but to create a truth so complete that denial would be difficult. People who lie spend a lot of energy keeping the lie consistent. They forget that consistency leaves traces. I collected those traces. You can't force someone to feel guilt. You can only show them the reflection of their choices until they can't avoid it. I needed a situation where truth could not be dismissed as paranoia. I began with small confrontations. Not big accusations, those would have sent him into defensive silence, but precise questions that planted doubt in his armor. I asked about names, dates, things only someone keeping track would get wrong. I watched his micro-expressions, the tiny flinches where his lies had been practiced. Then I escalated carefully. I invited friends for dinner and asked casual questions about his week in public, where an answer had to be given in front of witnesses. I let him talk and then I let him falter. People who lie in isolation often trip when forced to repeat. Finally, I planned the reveal. It was not a public shout from a rooftop or a humiliating spectacle. Instead, I arranged a small, private gathering, a dinner with a few people he respected, the kind of scene where reputation matters. I invited his closest friend from work, the woman who had unknowingly become my witness, and a mutual friend who could speak plainly. On the night, I placed the evidence on the table like a meal we were sharing. Photographs, messages, receipts. I sat quietly. He arrived with a charm that had won hearts before mine, the practiced one. He was puzzled by the atmosphere. The conversation started casual and then became attentive. When I showed the first screenshot, he tried to laugh. When I read a message aloud, his face strained. He attempted explanations, telling me the truth had been misread, that there were context and misunderstandings. The calm narrative he'd used for years started to fray. I spoke slowly. I let each piece land like a pebble into a quiet pond and then watched the ripples. The worst sound is the silence that follows the first undeniable proof. At first, he denied. Then he offered half-truths. Finally, when all doors to denial were closed and the room had become a jury, he crumbled. He didn't hit me or yell or beg. He sat and made small apologies that were all hinge and no door. I didn't mean for this to happen, he said. He sounded like the man in those old movies who finally understands the cost of a selfish act, but not how to repair it. He looked at the faces around him, friends that had once trusted him, and for the first time I could see the shape of how what he had done appeared to the world. He tried to explain. He said she had reached out first. He said he had been lonely. He said the worst thing he could say, that he had been looking for someone to understand him in ways he felt I didn't. His words had the vanity of someone who believed his feelings justified his choices. But feelings never come with a free pass. The room became a landscape of consequences. His friend from work, who had once admired him, said softly, "You could have told us." The mutual friend, who had been drinking her coffee quietly, asked, "Was our marriage just something you maintained?" The questions were small, each one a precise blade. He flailed. He apologized, but his apologies were not steady enough to build a bridge. I didn't want to break him in public. I wanted him to take responsibility. I wanted him to answer the simplest question plainly. Did he love me enough to stop? The answer, given through a trembling voice, was no, or at least, it was not a yes. When you expose someone to the people who matter and let them be witnesses to his choices, you don't always get the satisfaction you expect. There is no cinematic collapse. There is the quiet that follows, and sometimes that is more brutal than any scream. That night, we didn't fight in the operatic way movies sell you. We sat in silence. He packed a small bag and left for a few days, claiming he needed space. I let him go because I needed the space too, not to miss him, but to think. People asked what I would do. Friends said things that sounded like they'd been written in a handbook. Don't make any decisions in the first 6 months. Protect yourself legally. Talk to someone. I did some of those things, not because I wanted to be procedural, but because being practical is a refuge when emotions are wild. I contacted a counselor. I spoke to a lawyer about what his financial choices meant. I removed the photos of us from the living room. I began to rebuild the small corners of myself I'd let him occupy. I took long walks alone and listened to my footsteps. The world, which once revolved around the two of us, felt like it had shifted its axis. He called occasionally, sometimes apologizing, sometimes offering explanations. I answered some calls and ignored others. I discovered a strange freedom in reshaping my own story. I learned that self-respect doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like choosing your own routine again. I made lists of things I wanted for myself that had nothing to do with him. I took a cooking class. I started to go to bed on time. I laughed at small things without feeling guilty. A few months later, he asked to meet. I had been thinking and thinking and thinking. I agreed to see him once, in a neutral public place. We talked. He asked for forgiveness in a way that was still rooted in him, not in me. Forgiveness is complicated. You can forgive a person without forgetting. You can choose a softer life without choosing to return to a place where your dignity is in question. I decided not to stay. Not because I wanted to punish him, but because I wanted to prioritize myself. I realized that love that tolerates betrayal is not noble, it is weak. I walked away with the pieces of my life stitched up and with the knowledge that sometimes the bravest revenge is to live well. If there is a moral to this story, it is not a simple do this, don't do that. Life rarely offers tidy morals. But in the quiet that followed, certain truths settled into me like steady anchors. First, trust is both precious and fragile. It deserves to be protected, not hoarded, but defended. When someone violates it, you have the right to walk, to repair, or to expose, whatever puts your dignity first. Second, evidence matters. When you feel something wrong, don't drown in emotion, collect facts. Use your mind as well as your heart. Third, revenge isn't always about breaking people. Often the most exacting revenge is the life you rebuild, the career you pursue, the kindness you show, the self you respect. I don't tell this story to shame him. I tell it so other women and men can see that betrayal can be met with clarity instead of chaos. I tell it because the quiet way people betray you can make you doubt your own senses. Gather proof. Seek witnesses. And remember, the world usually respects those who act with dignity, not with spectacle. A final thing, we are complicated creatures capable of wrong and right. He made a choice that broke our promise. I made a choice that saved myself. In the end, that was the only justice I wanted, to be whole again.